On a cold February evening in Vancouver, a billionaire sat alone at a table for two, watching the door his Nephew had just walked out of, and a 10-year-old boy in a soaked hoodie walked in through the back. He wasn't supposed to be there. The staff at Alderview would make sure of that within the next 90 seconds. But before they did, the boy found the one table that mattered, leaned down close, and said 4 words that changed everything. "Don't drink that wine." What happened in the 2 hours that followed would unravel 3 years of careful deception, and set in motion something neither of them could have predicted. The snow had started around 4 that afternoon, the soft, unhurried kind that settled on Vancouver's West End like a held breath. By the time Stuart Aldrich arrived at the restaurant that bore his family name, the streets outside were white and quiet. The kind of quiet that made the city feel like it belonged to no one in particular. He was 61 years old. He had founded 3 companies, sold 2 of them, and kept the third, a mid-sized construction firm that had built half the condominiums along the False Creek waterfront. His name was on a concert hall downtown. His face appeared occasionally in the business section of the Vancouver Sun, though less often now than it had 20 years ago, when there had still been something to announce. These days, Stuart Aldrich was mostly just tired. He took his usual table near the window, the one the maitre d' had reserved without being asked. The restaurant was warm and low-lit, all dark wood and linen, the kind of place where conversations happened slowly and the wine arrived without ceremony. He ordered sparkling water and waited. His nephew, Brandon, was 12 minutes late. This was not unusual. Brandon Aldrich was 34, the son of Stuart's younger brother, who had died of a heart attack 6 years ago at 52. Stuart had always felt responsible for Brandon after that, had paid for his university education, brought him into the company, given him a role with a generous title and a salary that exceeded his output. It was the kind of arrangement that Stuart had told himself was temporary, a way of steadying the boy while he found his footing. 3 years later, Brandon still hadn't found it. "Sorry, traffic on the Granville Bridge," Brandon said, dropping into the chair across from him and unwinding his scarf. He had his father's jaw and his father's easy smile, and sometimes that smile made Stuart's chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. "You already ordered?" "Water," Stuart said. "How's the Burnaby project?" Brandon flagged down a server and ordered a whiskey before answering. "On track, mostly. There are a few permit issues I've been meaning to talk to you about." "You've been meaning to for 3 weeks. I know. I've been busy." Stuart said nothing. He had learned over the years that silence was often more effective than words with Brandon. It created a space the younger man felt compelled to fill, and what he filled it with was usually closer to the truth than whatever he'd prepared. But tonight, Brandon didn't seem uncomfortable. He seemed almost too relaxed, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who had already decided how the evening would go. They ordered dinner. Brandon had another whiskey. The conversation moved through familiar territory. The company, a legal matter that had been quietly resolved, a mutual acquaintance who had recently remarried. Stuart found himself watching his nephew more carefully than usual, noting a slight tension behind the easy manner, a quality of waiting in his eyes. "I wanted to talk to you about the will," Brandon said eventually, when the entrees had arrived. Stuart set down his fork. "Did you?" "Not in a morbid way, just practically. You've mentioned updating it, and I thought, since we're here, since we're talking, it might be worth discussing what you're thinking." "I haven't mentioned updating it," Stuart said. "Not to you." Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind Brandon's expression. "I thought you had." "Maybe I'm remembering wrong." "You're remembering wrong." A pause. Brandon reached for his wine glass, then seemed to reconsider and reached for his water instead. "I just think it's worth having the conversation. You don't have kids. Your assets are significant. It makes sense to be clear about your intentions." "My intentions are clear to me," Stuart said. "And to my lawyer." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted in the room between them, some atmospheric pressure that Stuart couldn't name, but could feel clearly. He watched his nephew eat. He watched the way Brandon's eyes occasionally moved to Stuart's wine glass. Not pointedly, not obviously, just with a quality of attention that was a shade too deliberate. The sommelier had brought a 2019 Burgundy, a bottle Brandon had recommended. Stuart had let it be poured. It sat untouched at his right hand. When Brandon excused himself to use the restroom, Stuart sat alone with the candle and the untouched wine, and a feeling he hadn't had since a failed acquisition attempt 15 years ago. The feeling of having been underestimated. He was sitting with that feeling when the boy appeared. He came from the direction of the kitchen corridor, wearing a gray zip-up hoodie dark with melted snow, his sneakers leaving wet prints on the hardwood. He was small for his age, with a narrow face and dark eyes set wide apart, and he moved through the room with the focused, unhurried confidence of someone who had learned to make himself unnoticeable. He stopped at Stuart's table. "Sir," he said quietly, "don't drink that wine." Stuart stared at him. "I beg your pardon. The wine in your glass. Don't drink it." The boy's voice was steady, but his hands were pressed flat against his thighs in the way of someone working very hard to appear calm. "I saw someone put something in it, at the bar when they poured it. Not the sommelier, the other man, the one you were having dinner with." Stuart said nothing for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. Cutlery, low voices, the soft percussion of the kitchen. A server was already moving toward them from across the room, with the particular expression of someone about to manage a situation. "What did you see?" Stuart asked. "A little bottle." He put it in his jacket pocket after. The boy met his eyes directly. "I know how this sounds. You don't know me. But I'm telling you the truth." The server arrived, apologetic and firm, a hand extended toward the boy's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Aldrich." He came in through the side entrance. "We're not sure how." "Leave him," Stuart said. The server hesitated. "Please," Stuart said. "Give us a moment." The server withdrew. The boy stood very still, as if uncertain whether this was better or worse than being removed. "What's your name?" Stuart asked. "Theo," the boy said. Then, after a pause, "Theo Kapoor. How old are you, Theo?" 10. "What were you doing near the bar?" Theo's gaze dropped briefly. "There's a heating vent outside the kitchen exit. I've been sleeping there some nights, when it's really cold." Stuart absorbed this without reacting. "You were outside. There's a gap in the side door. You can hear the kitchen from there sometimes. But tonight I was watching through the window by the bar. I like to watch the people." A small shrug, unself-conscious. "You can learn a lot." The sentence landed with unexpected weight. Stuart looked at the boy, the wet hoodie, the careful eyes, the small hands still pressed against his thighs. And then he looked at the wine glass. Brandon would be back in a minute or two. "Theo," Stuart said carefully, "I'm going to ask you to stay here for a moment. I need to speak with someone. Can you do that?" Theo looked at him. "Are you going to call the police?" "No," Stuart said. "I'm going to call my doctor." The next hour happened in pieces. Stuart sent a quiet message to his head of security, a man named Raymond who had worked for him for 9 years and asked very few questions. He asked the maitre to discreetly preserve the wine glass and its contents. When Brandon returned from the restroom, Stuart told him he wasn't feeling well and thought they should call it a night. Brandon had been almost too accommodating. That, in itself, told Stuart everything. A lab downtown processed urgent samples for the medical clinic Stuart had quietly funded for 8 years. The results came back before midnight. The wine had contained a diluted compound. Not immediately lethal, but in sufficient quantity over time, cumulative, the kind of thing that accumulated in the body and, in a man of Stuart's age with his particular cardiac history, would eventually look like a natural event. Detective O.C. of the Vancouver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Stuart's home on Point Grey Road at 11 o'clock that evening. She was thorough and unhurried, and she listened to everything Stuart had to say before she said anything herself. "Your nephew," she said. "My nephew," Stuart confirmed. "Any prior concerns?" Stuart thought about the way Brandon's eyes had moved to the wine glass, the question about the will, the way he'd smiled when he thought Stuart wasn't looking, not warmly, but with the private satisfaction of someone counting down. "Recent ones," he said. What Detective O.C. found over the following days would prove to be more complex than a single night's plan. Brandon had been in communication with a financial advisor, who specialized, it turned out, in a very particular kind of estate planning, the kind that required beneficiaries to act rather than wait. 2 other men had been involved. One of them had been the person who'd slipped something into the burgundy before the sommelier carried it to the table. But that was later. That night, sitting in his living room with a cup of tea he kept forgetting to drink, Stuart kept returning to one thing. Theo Kapoor was still at the restaurant. He'd left the boy with Raymond, who had confirmed by text that Theo was warm and had eaten half a plate of pasta and was refusing to say much beyond his name. Stuart had told Raymond to make sure the boy didn't leave, not in an ominous way. Just, don't let him disappear into the snow. He arrived back at Aldeview just before 10. The dinner service was winding down, the room softening into its late-night quiet. Raymond was at a corner table with a cup of coffee. Across from him, Theo sat with his knees pulled up, watching a group of servers fold napkins with the look of someone storing away information for later. When Theo saw Stuart, he straightened. "You're back," the boy said. "I said I would be." Stuart sat down. "Thank you for staying." "Raymond's bigger than I am," Theo said. Raymond made a face. "He said you ate something," Stuart said. "I was hungry." No apology in it, which Stuart appreciated. "The pasta was good. It is good. The chef has been making it the same way for 11 years. Stuart folded his hands on the table. "Theo, what you did tonight was significant. I need you to understand that." Theo looked at him steadily. "Did something happen to him?" "The man you were with? He's being questioned by the police." The boy was quiet for a moment. "Is he family?" "My nephew." Another pause. "I'm sorry," Theo said, and he sounded like he meant it. "So am I," Stuart said. He studied the boy across the table. The dark eyes, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of self-containment that he recognized from long experience as something built, not inherited. "You didn't look like that naturally. You looked like that because the world had given you reasons to." "Theo, where do you go at night? Where are you staying?" "Around," Theo said. "Around, I know the safe places. How long have you been on your own?" The boy looked at the napkin in front of him and smoothed a fold in it with one finger. "My mum got sick last spring. She had to go into long-term care. The apartment was in her name, so," he lifted one shoulder, "I didn't want to go into a group home." Stuart was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" "My friend Danny went into one. He said it was bad. The other kids took his stuff. Nobody cared." Theo looked up. "I figured I could manage better on my own." "And have you?" Theo seemed to consider whether honesty served him here. Then he said, with the resigned precision of someone reporting facts, "Some nights are better than others." Stuart nodded. "I want to offer you a place to stay. Tonight, and after tonight, while we figure out the longer situation. I have a large house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Baxter, will be there. You'll have your own room, meals, whatever you need." Theo looked at him. "Why?" "Because you saved my life. Because you're 10 years old and sleeping next to a heating vent in February." Stuart paused. "And because I think you might be one of the most observant people I've ever met, and I've met a great many." The boy was quiet for a long moment, working through something internal that his face almost but didn't quite hide. "My mum," he said finally. "I visit her on Thursdays. Then we'll make sure Thursdays work," Stuart said. Theo looked at Raymond, who nodded once, solemnly, as though confirming that this man could be trusted in at least the basic mechanical sense. Then Theo looked back at Stuart. "1 week," he said. "I'll try it for 1 week. "That's all I'm asking," Stuart said. The Point Grey house was the kind of house that made people go quiet when they first saw it, not because it was showy, but because it was genuinely beautiful in a way that took a moment to absorb. Tall windows, a garden that reached the edge of a small ravine, rooms that felt like they'd been lived in by people who had actual thoughts. Stuart had bought it 20 years ago for the library on the 2nd floor, which was the kind of thing only a certain sort of person said and meant. Theo went quiet when he saw it. Then he said, "You live here alone?" "Mrs. Baxter lives in the garden suite," Stuart said. "Otherwise, yes." "That's a lot of house for one person." "It is," Stuart agreed. Mrs. Baxter was 63, practical, and had seen enough of Stuart's life that very little surprised her. She showed Theo to the guest room on the upper floor, a room with a window seat and bookshelves, and a duvet that was probably worth more than most people's furniture, and told him where the towels were and what time breakfast was, and that she made oatmeal on weekday mornings, but if he wanted eggs he only had to ask. Theo thanked her with a formality that was clearly habitual, and Mrs. Baxter told Stuart later that evening, quietly in the kitchen, that the boy had the manners of someone who'd been taught carefully, and the eyes of someone who'd been on his own for too long. He folded his wet hoodie before he put it on the radiator, she said, so it wouldn't drip on the floor. Stuart didn't answer, but he thought about that for a while. In the days that followed, the investigation moved forward in the way investigations do, methodically, incrementally, with occasional calls to Stuart from Detective Osei, that confirmed small but significant things. The compound in the wine had been traced to a source that connected to one of Brandon's associates. A search of Brandon's home office had turned up documents, correspondence about the estate, projections about asset distribution, notes on timeline that were chilling in their calm. Brandon's lawyer was arguing coercion. Brandon himself had, in Detective Osie's careful phrasing, become cooperative to a limited extent. Stuart found it hard to feel much beyond a tired, gray sadness. He had tried for 6 years to be what his brother would have wanted. He had not managed it. Whether that was his failure or Brandon's was a question he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to answer cleanly. In the meantime, Theo was in his house, and Theo was remarkable in ways that kept catching Stuart off guard. The boy read everything. He worked through Stuart's library with the concentrated focus of someone who had been waiting for access to exactly this. Not scanning, not skimming, but reading the way a hungry person eats, with complete attention. He had gaps in his formal education that the first week made obvious, but alongside those gaps were areas of knowledge that had no obvious source. He knew the migratory patterns of several species of Pacific birds. He could identify cloud formations and predict the weather with a reliability that impressed Mrs. Baxter. He had strong opinions about the structural integrity of certain bridges and could explain why. "Where did you learn about bridges?" Stuart asked one morning, finding Theo at the kitchen table with a book on civil engineering that he'd taken from the library. "I slept under a few," Theo said, turning a page. "You pay attention." Stuart sat down across from him. "What's your favorite thing you've read so far?" Theo considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. "The one about the man who mapped the ocean floor," he said finally. "He spent his whole life making a picture of something nobody could see, and he was right. He just never got credit for it while he was alive." "Marie Tharp," Stuart said. "Her," Theo confirmed, "and also the one about the building codes." "Did you know most fire escapes in older buildings were added after the fact? They weren't part of the original plan. Someone had to die first, and then people cared." Stuart looked at him. "That seems to have bothered you." "It bothers me when people only pay attention after something goes wrong," Theo said simply. "You should pay attention before." It was the most complete description of what Theo had done at the restaurant that either of them would ever give. On Thursday, Stuart drove Theo to the long-term care facility in Burnaby where Theo's mother lived. Her name was Priya Kapoor. She was 41 years old and had early-onset Parkinson's disease, which had progressed faster than anyone had expected. She was sitting in a chair by the window when they arrived, a blanket across her knees and a paperback novel open in her lap, and when Theo walked through the door, she looked up with a smile that rearranged everything in the room. "Theo," she said. "Hi, Mom." He crossed to her and hugged her carefully, the way you hug someone when you've learned to be careful, and she held onto him with both hands for a moment before letting go. Stuart waited by the door. He felt profoundly that he was witnessing something private. He also felt with a clarity that surprised him that this woman, this 41-year-old woman with shaking hands and a paperback novel, had done something extraordinary. She had raised this boy. She had taught him to fold his hoodie on the radiator, and to speak with courtesy to strangers and to pay attention, always pay attention, before something went wrong. He introduced himself, and she looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze that Theo had clearly inherited. "You're the man from the restaurant," she said. "I am," Theo told me. Her hands steadied slightly when she clasped them together. "He said he warned someone, and it mattered. He didn't tell me the details. He saved my life," Stuart said. Priya looked at her son for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was complicated and fierce and entirely maternal. "He's been staying with you?" she asked. "For the past week. I've been hoping he might agree to stay longer." Stuart paused. "I'd like to talk to you about that, if you're willing." She studied him. "You have a large house," she said. "I do. And no children. No." She looked at Theo, who was watching both of them with his hands in his hoodie pocket, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who wanted very much to seem like they didn't care about the outcome of a conversation. "What does Theo want?" she asked. Theo answered before Stuart could. "I want to not worry about you worrying about me," he said. "If that's possible." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a small, real, slightly tired laugh, and said, "You sound like your father." Theo seemed to take this as a compliment. The legal arrangements took several weeks. The child welfare process was thorough and occasionally frustrating, but Stuart's lawyer had handled unusual family arrangements before, and the social worker assigned to Theo's case, a woman named Ms. Bergeron, who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen the full range of human circumstance and remained, against all odds, optimistic, concluded in her report that the placement was exceptionally well suited to the child's needs and demonstrated resilience. Theo's mother approved the temporary guardianship arrangement with conditions that Stuart agreed to entirely: weekly visits, documentation of Theo's schooling, and a single stated requirement from Priya herself. "Tell me the truth," she said to Stuart, "about everything, good and bad. Don't manage me." "I won't," Stuart said. "He doesn't like to be fussed over," she added. "He gets embarrassed. Don't make a big deal of things." "Noted," Stuart said. Theo's enrollment at Queensbury Day School began in March. The gaps in his education were addressed by a patient woman named Dr. Amara, who worked with him 3 afternoons a week and reported, after the second session, that she had never tutored anyone who asked better questions. The school itself was initially uncertain. Theo was a year behind in some areas, well ahead in others, and arrived with a manner that the deputy headmistress described, not unkindly, as bracing. Theo made one friend in the first month. Her name was Yuki. She was 11, and she was interested in the same things he was, which turned out to be quite a lot of things. On the Thursday, Stuart drove them both to the library on Burrard Street and watched them navigate the stacks. With the purposeful energy of small researchers, he thought about how recently this boy had been sleeping next to a heating vent and found it difficult to reconcile with the person sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading about plate tectonics. He mentioned this to Theo that evening, carefully, not wanting to make it a big deal. Theo looked up from his book. "I'm the same person," he said. "I know. The circumstances are different. The person is the same." Stuart nodded. "I know that too." Theo went back to his book. Then after a moment, "Stuart, yes? Why do you spend so many evenings working in the library instead of just going to bed?" Stuart considered this. "Because I haven't quite known what else to do with evenings. For a long time." Theo nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "I used to count the lights in buildings at night," he said. "You can see who's still awake. You feel less alone." It was the most directly Theo had ever spoken about what the street had been like, and he said it without wait or bid for sympathy, just as information, as something that had been true and was now less true. Stuart let it be what it was. "There are usually lights on in this library until quite late," Stuart said. Theo looked up. "I know," he said. "I can see them from my room." They sat quietly for a while after that, the city making its soft nighttime sounds outside the window, both of them reading, which was not nothing, and was in fact quite a lot. Brandon pleaded guilty in June, on the advice of his lawyer, and with a cooperation agreement that implicated both additional associates. The sentencing was scheduled for autumn. Stuart did not attend the proceedings. He had written a statement for the court and given it to his lawyer, and found that he had nothing more to say about the matter, at least not yet. On the day the guilty plea was entered, Theo came home from school and found Stuart sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold. "Something happened," Theo said. "It wasn't a question." "Brandon pleaded guilty today," Stuart said. Theo sat down. He didn't say he was sorry, because he was learning when that was useful and when it wasn't. He sat with Stuart in the kitchen for a while, and Mrs. Baxter brought them both fresh tea without being asked, and outside the kitchen window the June light did what June light in Vancouver does, which is to say it lasted and refused to give up. "Can I ask you something?" Theo said eventually. "You can ask me anything," Stuart said. "Did you love him? Brandon, I mean." Stuart looked at the window. "I loved who I thought he might become," he said. "The person I hoped was there, underneath." Theo was quiet. "Then my dad left when I was 4. I used to wonder if he'd come back different. If there was a better version of him somewhere that just hadn't found us yet. And now I think some people are just who they are." Theo wrapped both hands around his mug. "But I also think some people change. So I'm not sure which kind he was." "That's a more honest answer than most adults would give," Stuart said. "You said to always tell the truth." "I did," Stuart said. They drank their tea. The June light held. Theo's mother had a better autumn than anyone had expected. A new medication reduced the tremor significantly, and on 2 occasions she was well enough to come to the Point Grey house for dinner. An event that required some coordination and Mrs. Baxter's complete command of the logistics, but which produced both times evenings that Stuart would remember for a long time. Priya Kapoor had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly. She and Stuart argued about architecture at the second dinner for 45 minutes, while Theo ate his soup with the contented expression of someone watching something good happen. "You're not as cautious as I thought you'd be," Priya said to Stuart near the end of that second evening. "What did you expect?" he asked. "Rich men who take in strays are usually either saints or they want something," she said. "You seem to be neither." "I'm not sure I qualify as neither," Stuart said. "You want company," she said. "That's different from wanting something. Most people want company. They're just not honest about it." Theo, from across the table, looked up from his soup. "You're both very weird," he said pleasantly, "but I think it's working out." It was a Saturday morning in late October, the kind of morning that comes to Vancouver in autumn, with low clouds and the smell of rain and a light that made everything look as though it was remembering summer. Stuart and Theo were at the Granville Island Market, working their way through the permanent stalls with the kind of unhurried focus that had become characteristic of their weekend routines. Theo was examining a display of dried herbs with the concentration of someone taking inventory when he went still. "Stuart," he said quietly. Stuart followed his gaze. Near the edge of the market, half hidden behind a pillar, a girl of about 8 or 9 stood watching the food stalls with a hunger that was not quite about food. She wore a thin jacket insufficient for the weather, and she was alone in the particular way that was different from just being without an adult nearby. Stuart looked at Theo. "Same thing you saw?" he asked. "Same thing," Theo said. They moved in the way they'd developed over months of being around each other. Unhurried, without fuss, no performance. Theo drifted toward the girl while Stuart spoke to one of the market vendors, quietly, and arranged for a bag of food to be ready. By the time he turned back, Theo was crouched down to the girl's level, talking to her in a low voice. Whatever he was saying, she was listening. Her name was Adeze. She was 9. The details that emerged over the next hour were the kind of details that Stuart now knew how to hear. Not just the surface facts, but the specific texture of a child's situation, the particular shape of what was missing and what was still, stubbornly, intact. "She's not alone," Theo said to Stuart quietly, when Adeze had agreed to sit with them on a bench and eat a warm bun from the market bag. "She has a grandmother, but the grandmother's in the hospital and there's no one else right now." Stuart made a phone call to Ms. Bergeron. He made a second call to a colleague on the board of a family resource center in East Vancouver that he'd quietly funded for 6 years. By the time the 3 of them had finished their market bag, there was a plan in motion, not permanent, not complete, but real. Something that would hold Adeze safe until her grandmother came home. As they walked back to the car, Theo was quiet in the particular way that meant he was processing something. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always," Stuart said. "The center in East Van. How long have you been funding that?" 6 years. Theo looked at him. "Before me, long before you. So you were already doing this, helping people quietly, trying to," Stuart said, "with varying success." Theo thought about this. "You were lonely," he said, "but you weren't useless." Stuart found to his own surprise that this was almost unbearably comforting. "No," he said, "I wasn't useless." Theo nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay," he said. "Good." They drove back to Point Grey through the October rain, the city grey and green and full of its own continuing life, and Theo fell asleep against the window about 10 minutes into the drive, the quick, unguarded sleep of a child who had decided, in the way children do when they finally decide, that he was safe. Stuart drove carefully. He didn't turn on the radio. Outside, the rain moved in from the sea the way it always did in Vancouver in autumn, steady and unhurried, as if it had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush, which was, Stuart thought, not a bad way to approach most things. The kind of patience that didn't require you to stop paying attention. The kind that waited until you understood what you were looking at. He glanced once at the boy asleep against the window, at the rain-blurred city moving past them both. Then he kept his eyes on the road and drove them home.